The following morning, the couple re-evaluated their progress and decided to walk during the day and rest at night. After having something to eat from their dwindling supplies, they descended their safe haven and began to slog along the now muddy road. Progress was slow, with hidden potholes covered with last night's surface runoff. Michael did not manage to sleep at all the previous night, but they decided to press on. He told his wife that they should simply walk until they could no longer walk. Forsaking sleep and rest, his first priority was to minimize their time in this inhospitable place. The couple walked and walked until they could walk no longer. Their feet were numbed, swollen, and stiffened. Their bodies were wet with perspiration and sore with aches. All their clothes were soiled, muddy, and torn. Looking at each other, they had not expected to see themselves in such a sorry state. Necessity drove them to fall on the muddy ground and sleep. It was noon when the couple were forced to discontinue their walk. Although everything was watery and muddy, the tropical heat was unbearable, compounded by the humidity. They lay in the mud, sweating from the sweltering heat. The couple's sleep was interrupted 3 hours later. It was around 3:30 p.m., when Michael woke up with a shout of terror when his body received a kick from a strong foot. Christina also received one on her butt. She did not only shout but kept on screaming as if she saw the devil standing in the flesh front of her. In her terror, she began to scream unintelligibly. Her fear increased as her eyes focused and took in the scene around them. Her screaming reached a zenith until she could scream no more. Instead of one scary creature, she discovered they were so many of them. At first, she thought they were black ghosts. Then, her mind told her that they were ferocious jungle beasts. Her phobic response quietened when one of those scary creatures opened his mouth and made some kind of a gesture. She jumped to the hasty conclusion that it was half human and half animal. He appeared to her disturbed mind as a monstrous humanoid. All those creatures were as black as the dark of the night, but when they opened their mouths they had teeth as white as snow. Michael was the first one to identify them as some species of human beings, but his mind rejected the possibility of being ordinary human beings. Whatever his mind had told him, he still refused to give them the status of human beings. First off, human beings could not be that black and monstrous in their outside appearances. Second, no matter how savage, human beings crave adornment and do not go around fully naked. They were standing in front them, as naked as babies. Their genitals revealed that they were males. Michael's mind struggled for a while before at last it admitted the scary creatures were indeed human. That conclusion was forced on his head when he heard those monstrous humans began to talk to each other in a kind of humanly dialect. It wasn't a kind of dialect that angry or humans happy might communicate to each other. It sounded like some cannibal barbarians found some fresh human meat and fighting about who would devour it. Michael shouted at his wife and told her that by her continuous screaming those human beings might get irritated and kill her. Christina shouted back as loud as she could and told him those weren't human beings but some black-skinned elves of the jungle of Africa, who had gathered around to partake of their next meal, them. Before Michael could respond to his wife, he saw yet another species join the so-called black-skinned elves. The new arrivals refuted his wife's conclusion and assured him that they were definitely some kind of aboriginal beings. He felt like Marco Polo who discovered new species of humanity yet unknown to man. They were all completely naked save small pieces of skin covering their genitals. Their fully exposed big breasts indicated that they were the females' counterparts of the males. Their arrival brought a glimmer of hope for Christina and made her stop shouting, but she continued to quack and tremble and her teeth kept on gnashing. Michael knew none of those savages knew English, still spoke some words to them. The way they responded made him to regret that he opened his mouth. One of them hit him with a big stick on his back. Other two lifted him by the hands until his feet hung in the air. These Africans were so tall, but they were very skinny, as if they didn't eat enough food. One of them grabbed Christina by her long hair and forced her on her feet. He did not let go of her hair until she screamed and bit his hand. A woman responded by delivering a slap. Michael shouted at his wife and told her to try not to respond physically to their rough behavior. The American couple's hands were tied with ropes and they were forced to march with their captors. They concluded that they were being taken to caves to eventually become their next meal. They followed in silence, but their hearts were beating as loud as drums. All the dangers they had faced in the north of Sudan had not filled their hearts with so much fear as the current predicament. After a long walk through the dense jungle, the dark-skinned people finally brought them to their temporary camp. It contained so many small huts, hardly any one of them could be enough for 2 people to sleep in it. The couple perceived that those jungle people had not yet socially developed to have the concept of family. They were still like a herd of animals which lived together, but slept separately. Their conclusion was confirmed when they witnessed some of them having sexual intercourse openly and no one seemed to bother. Michael began to worry that one of the males might recognize his wife as a female and jump on her and rape her in front of him, and he could do nothing to save her since he was tied up. Nothing of the sort happened. Instead, her hands were freed from the ropes by 2 women. Then, she was given some milk to drink and some roots to eat. Michael scared that, if his wife refused to eat their food, they might feel offended and kill her. He told her to bless what they had offered to her and consume it. She trusted her husband and drank the milk and ate what was placed before her. The same generosity was not offered to Michael. He was left lying on his back while his hands and legs were tied together. Christina's hands were tied up again, but her feet were left free. After that, some men came and carried Michael's body and took him to another part of the camp and left him there. Michael resisted, but he couldn't stop the men from transferring him and separating him from his wife. Christina cried and called out for Michael, told him not to leave her alone with those people. Michael was puzzled for some time about the strange behavior of the barbarians. He could not make out why they showed some kindness towards his wife by feeding her, but refused to be hospitable to him. Was it because she was a female that why they cared about her and ignored him because he was a male? His mind immediately rejected such possibility when he remembered they had replaced her ropes as soon as they had fed her. They refused to feed him and also separated him from his wife. His intellect began to direct his thoughts to a different direction. He reasoned out that those jungle people might be preparing his wife for some kind of satanic ritual. They might want to prepare her for a kind of human sacrifice or might want to take her to their chief for his pleasure. Whatever their intention, he knew that he shouldn't leave Christina alone with those savages. Unfortunately, he found himself in a helpless situation, worse off than when he was imprisoned in that locked-up hut in Nayad town. At least at that time, he was not bound hand and foot. Here he was kept alone in one part of the camp and he couldn't use his hands or legs. The only thing he could do was to pray to God and wait for him to do the rescue. Michael's worries were very true. Those jungle people were neither Christians nor Muslims nor even followers of any other world religion. They were African animists. They worshipped the spirits of their ancestors whom they believed remained with them after death. They had also deified the chief of their tribe. He was living in a high mountain not far from where they were living, with 1,001 women. Every female he desired was available to him. His captors intended to slay Michael as human sacrifice under the sacred tree of the spirits of their dead ancestors and then eat his flesh. After that, they wanted to take Christina to their chief to add to his wifely collection. Some of the tribe had in the past succeeded in going as far up as the Miseria villages and towns in the North Sudanese border, where they skirmished with the locals and abducted one particular girl for their chief, which resulted in the kidnappers gaining high favor with the chief. The chief impregnated that girl many times until finally she died while giving birth to child number 15. When she died, he offered her body to the sacred tree of the spirits of his ancestors and then ate her flesh. Thereafter, he sent many of his men back to raid the Mezeria tribes, but they always got themselves killed, and so he had yet to own another Arab. Many of those primitive people believed that their little females should first be deflowered by their chief before they were given to other men. So, their chief almost raped every female child and impregnated her before another male slept with her. That day, those Antichrist captors considered themselves very lucky to find such a white-skinned woman with such ease and without any need to fight or risk their lives. The previous girl was a black Arab woman who had relatively had lighter skin color compared to their pitch black skin color. On the same day, they found Christina. They sent a word to their chief that a very white Arab woman was on her way to him on the following morning. Besides the worry about the fate of his beloved Christina, Michael was tortured by the millions of mosquitoes and other insects that were hovering over his head and feasting on his exposed flesh. Those mosquitoes could make a dead corpse to walk. Michael believed that, if he remained until the morning in that miserable situation, there would not be a single drop of blood remaining in his body. For the first time in his life, he wished that he was dead and gone instead of being alive and experiencing such an unbearable torture. He could not use his hands to ward off the parasitic pests, so he just kept on rolling around and around like an epileptic person. For 8 months, while they were living in the house of the Sudanese old woman Sakina, Michael and Christina enjoyed the luxury of a mosquito net during the night and escaped that kind of torture. In addition, they used to burn local herbs and wood to ward mosquitoes off. When away from their hut, they would liberally spray repellent from head to toe to avoid being bitten by mosquitoes and other equally virulent bugs. Before fleeing from the charity home, their thoughtful hosts had given them some repellent which they had used up until the time they were captured by the jungle people. All these precautions were necessary, emphasized Dr. Cuckoo, adding that African mosquitoes, among others, can infect its host with the West Nile virus, dengue fever, and malaria. Michael was treated as a totem animal and kept outside the camp so that they could offer him in the morning as a human sacrifice under the sacred tree of their dead ancestors, following which they would drink his blood and devour his flesh. On the contrary, Christina was treated as the bride of the Nile, housed in a small hut, and cloaked in animal fur. She was fed well, her body was fully covered, and she was securely kept in a safe place. Those jungle people knew full well what would happen if the Arabian bride of the Nile got bitten by the night insects, only to fall ill or die before being taken to the chief. Michael concluded that their many sins had brought all those punishments upon them. They had overtly denied Christ, instead claimed belief in Muhammad, replaced the Bible with the Quran, and changed their names twice to Muslim names. He remembered the case of King David and his sins of committing adultery with Bathsheba, illegally impregnating her, murdering her husband Uriah the Hittite, taking her to be his wife, sinning against his nation, and of course sinning against God. Although David repented and God forgave him, still he bore the consequences of his sins. His own son Absalom revolted against him, he ran away before his son and enemies, his son took his concubines and openly slept with them in his father's palace, etc. It was clear to Michael that what his wife and he were going through was the aftermath of their sins. He knew that they had repented of their sins and he believed that God had forgiven them, but they were experiencing the outcome of their sins. He did not know if their sins would finally result in their untimely death. No matter what might be the final result of their sins, Michael decided never again to deny Christ or pretend to be a follower of any man-made religions, following only the divine faith of his Savior, the Lord Jesus. In all that, Michael never doubted the assurance of his salvation. He was a strong believer in the biblical doctrines of predestination, election, and eternal security of the believers in Christ. He thoroughly studied and believed in the 4 points: Calvinism, tulip, total depravity of sinners, unconditional election, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. But, he rejected the teaching of limited atonement because it is simply not supported by the Bible. He did not accept all the teachings of the Reformation theology. He did not believe in child baptism, he rejected the replacement theology where the church was made to replace Israel, he also strongly rejected the unbiblical teachings that the Jews were rejected, cursed people, and have no future, etc. In this regard, he was a believer in dispensationalism, which maintains a fundamental distinction between Israel and the Church. There are two peoples of God with two different destinies, earthly Israel and the spiritual Church. A distinction between the rapture and the second coming of Christ. The rapture of the Church at Christ's coming in the air, 1 Thessalonians 4:17, precedes the official second coming, to the earth, by 7 years of tribulation. He believed in a literal earthly 1,000-year millennial kingdom that has yet to come but soon will, Isaiah 9, 6-7, 11, 1-9, Revelation 20, 1-6. For the second time on that day, Michael was kicked in the back and jolted out of his brief slumber. That night, he either fainted due to the torture of the mosquitoes or fatigue had overcome him. He had desperately tried to free his hands and legs from the strong ropes, but he couldn't. He tried to roll his body back to the camp, but he was prevented by the many stones, holes, and thorns. He wept bitterly for his inability to reach his beloved and rescue her. He thought that her circumstances were far more miserable situation than his. When everything did not work, he just continued to weep, pray, and ask God to protect his wife. He remained in that situation until finally toward the dawn he fell asleep, delirious. He was neither sleeping nor unconscious, but he fell into an ontological state. Even hibernating animal would be in better physical state than his. This time, the person who kicked him was wearing military boots. His powerful kick could bring a dead body back to life. He was dressed up as a soldier. He was carrying an AK-47 Kalashnikov in his hands. He looked serious and mad. Michael was shocked when the soldier spoke to him in an American accent with perfect English. It was even an African American English. He ordered him to stand on his feet. Michael was surprised when he found his hands and feet were freed of those ropes. He thought, he was either hallucinating and seeing things, or experiencing a horrific nightmare. The angry soldier grabbed his hands and literally lifted him up and dragged him like an animal until he stood on his feet. Michael stood on his feet and looked around him. He saw all those unclothed black-skinned people who captured and brought them over there, were tied with ropes and made to kneel down on their knees. He did not see Christina among them. He was worried about his beloved. He tried to communicate with the soldier who woke him up, but he did not see him within his reach. He saw at least other 10 soldiers in their uniforms and carrying their assault rifles. His mind began to grasp what was going on. Those soldiers, he thought, had raided the camp of those jungle people while they were sleeping in their small huts. He reasoned out, somehow those soldiers learned that 2 foreigners had been abducted and a rescue mission had been ordered. Michael wished in his heart his supposition was correct, the other options being too difficult to accept. He clung to the wish for the briefest moment before he had to discard even that. He saw the guy who kicked him with his heavy boot, spoke to him in American English, and forced him to stand on his feet, opened fire on those unarmed jungle people, and the other soldiers joined him. In cold blood, all those people were shot in their heads and backs and killed. They were young and old, men and women, and little children. Michael closed his eyes and began to weep. He wasn't weeping for the fear of death, but for the epic brutality he is an unwilling witness to. He knew that man was born sinner and lived sinful life, and God said his heart was desperately wicked, but he never expected that human beings house such evil. He saw evil, he smelled evil, and felt evil as a creature that was engulfing his body and about to swallow him up like wheat. His fear of death left his heart, and he prayed to God to take his life and rid him of this evil generation. Even the Muslim ISIS terrorists hadn't gone down to that level of brutality by murdering non-combatant children and women in cold blood en masse. They took them as war captives and raped some and sold some as slaves. To say the least, they saved their lives because they were children and women. Those military soldiers also did not bother to bury the bodies of their victims. They just left their dead bodies lying on the open to be eaten by the wild beasts and ravenous vultures. At least, ISIS terrorists buried their victims in mass graves. Sometimes, ISIS terrorists buried their victims alive in mass graves. Many times, some of those Iraqi and Syrian victims were buried alive in those mass graves. The African soldiers just searched the small huts of their victims and took what they wanted to take and forced Michael to follow them. He tried to resist, but they beat him and dragged him along anyway. They did not go for far distance until Michael spotted his beloved sitting on top of a huge military truck guarded by a soldier. He offered prayer of thanksgiving to the Lord for keeping Christina alive. The soldier, who woke him up, came and told him to climb on the truck and sit near his girlfriend. Michael followed the order and jumped up in a second. He threw his arms around his beloved and embraced her and began to weep again. This time, he shed tears of joy. Christina responded by hugging her lover so passionately as the little child who found her mother after she had been forcibly separated from her. All the soldiers climbed in the truck and surrounded Michael and his wife. The truck began to move. The couple were too afraid to talk. They did not know whether they were prisoners or rescued victims. The unfriendly attitude of the soldiers up to this point did nothing to calm their fears. The soldiers conversed in their mother tongue. Michael was tempted to speak to the soldier who spoke to him in English, but he decided that restraint was the better part of valor. He decided to wait until the right opportunity arose. One of the soldiers pointed his hand toward Christina and then moved it flatly over his mouth and made loud kissing sound. He spoke some words in his language which made the others to laugh. Christina understood the gesture of the soldier and huddled closer to her husband as if she discovered a cobra not far from her. Her response made the English-speaking soldier intervene and explain what his colleague meant and said. "Domak Gat Enil likes your girlfriend," laughingly said the soldier. "He said she is as sweet as a mango." Michael knew the explanation was directed to him, but he decided to ignore it. He did not want to challenge Domak Gat Enil or praise him for his comments. Domak Gat Enil stood up and hit his back and said something which led all of them to scream in unison laughter. The English-speaking soldier spoke again, translating, "Domak Gat Enil says your woman has a very big butt." Michael could not control his feelings. He said angrily, "It is none of his business and it isn't funny." "Are you an American man?" asked the English-speaking soldier. "Yes, I am, and my wife too. I lived 10 years in America. I went there as a displaced refugee." Michael preferred not to indulge those soldiers in any friendly talk until he could figure out their intentions. "You guys made me to clean up your toilets although I had earned a university degree from the University of New Delhi in India. That is why I returned to my country and became a soldier. We are warriors in our countries and you make us your servants when we come to you for help." "I am sorry to hear that, sir. I agree with you that you had been treated unfairly. In spite of that, I don't hate America and Americans. They are still gracious people to us by offering us shelter in time of need. Sir, I can see that you are a good man. May I ask you a question?" "Go ahead. How did you know about us and come for our rescue?" The soldier laughed before he responded to the question. "We didn't come for your rescue. We did not know even you guys have been kidnapped by those fucking Dinka people. We just came to kill them and happened to find you with them. It was mere coincidence." "Why did you kill them?" "Because all Dinka people are our enemies and we hate them. If we don't kill them, they kill us." Michael began to connect the dots. He heard about the recently erupted civil war between the Dinka tribe and the Nuer tribe. He understood that the guy he was talking to was a leader of a Nuer group. He preferred not to offer a judgment, seeing as there was no benefit to it. "We are neither Dinkas nor Nuers, but circumstances forced us to come to your country. Why are we held prisoners by you? Your fate would be decided by our Nuer chieftains. We are told if you meet Dinkas you should kill them, and if you meet foreigners you have to hold them captive. The couple's riddle was solved through those few words. They become captives by chance. Their collective fates would be decided by a newer chief. It was logical that they were now headed for a newer town, and there they would meet people who were relatively more civil than the ones from whom they just gotten rescued. Michael wondered as where the freedom, human rights, democracy, secularism, equality of women and men, equal treatment of people regardless of their ethnic backgrounds that they had been promised resided in the newly founded Democratic Republic of South of Sudan. So far, they had seen nothing except evil to a degree they have never seen anywhere else. He tried to convince himself that they might see all those promises shining like lights in their big cities.